Good evening, everyone. The Parley project warmly welcomes you to its first student conference on data and democracy. It's a two-day conference wherein we'll be addressing issues of digital divide, surveillance capitalism, vote bank politics, and social media. For convenience purpose, the discussion has been divided into three sessions. Number one being social media and democracy. Then, following which, we'll be having a discussion on digital divide, and then we'll conclude with data politics. Our speakers for today are Mr. Kazim Rizvi, Mr. Abhishek Baxi, Ms. Tarunima Prabhakar, and Mr. Arindrajit Basu. Mr. Kazim Rizvi, a lawyer by profession, is a public policy entrepreneur and founder of an emerging policy think tank, The Dialogue. Abhishek Baxi is an independent digital consultant and a technology journalist writing for the Hindustan Times and the Modern Context. Ms. Tarunima Prabhakar is the co-founder and research lead at Tattle. She was a research fellow at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity at UC Berkeley. In the past, she has worked with the Data for Good team at Facebook and national-scale technology-led development projects in Asia. She is also a non-resident research fellow at Carnegie, India. Mr. Arindrajit Basu is a research-led lead at the Center for Internet and Society. Being a lawyer by profession, his writing covers geopolitics, constitutional law, and technology. We're absolutely honored to host you today. Priti, will you be presenting the PPT? Started in 2020, the Parley project is a student-led initiative that focuses on research-driven solutions for global agendas. We aim to connect students to professionals for mutually insightful discussions and conversations about various pressing agendas. Through various youth conferences and carefully curated agenda-specific events, we wish to bring together inquisitive minds to research and provide new insights into contemporary issues and come up with solutions for the same. We mainly have three forums for research ideation, focusing on climate leadership, international relations and geopolitics, and public policy. In the past, the Parley project has hosted many events. Amongst them are panel discussions, digital diplomacy boot camps, coffee conversations, research writing, cybersecurity, and e-advocacy workshops. Researchers across Parley are working on different issues. Amongst them are Prep with Parley, the YA Initiative, the Parley podcast, and last but not the least, the Student Conference. I will now be requesting Trisha to give a brief overview of her research project, following which I will be giving an overview about my research project on CIB. We will then be moving on to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Medha. Good evening, respected panelists. Thank you for joining us. I am Trisha Lal, a senior researcher here at Parley. The topic of the research project that I've chosen to undertake is international cooperation for the regulation of digital freedom in South Asia. It gives me great pleasure to now be introducing the topic to you. Over the past few decades, the importance of the internet in almost all societal processes has given way to important debates and discussions, some pertaining to the increasingly complex ways it alters civic engagement, communication, and security across the world, and others pertaining to laws and rules that govern the online space. The internet also lends an entirely new dimension to the rights of individuals, from privacy to freedom of expression, making its regulation a much more complicated endeavor. In my research, I will be focusing on digital freedom, a concept which integrates the freedom of expression and the freedom to access information without manipulation online. In Western developed countries such as the United States of America and those in Europe, the conversation around digital freedom has brought to light important features of the concept, such as its balance against protection from harmful content and its dependence on universal and equal access to the internet. In the context of developing South Asian countries, however, both perceptions and threats against digital freedom differ significantly from the rest of the world. With increasing penetration of the internet in these countries, growing instances of deterioration of digital freedom have been observed. Moreover, gaps and vagaries in existing regional and national frameworks make it difficult to enforce digital freedom. It is therefore imperative to address urgently the digital needs of the distinctive needs of digital freedom in these countries, and to regulate the same with most effective methods of international cooperation. What avenues could international law open for digital freedom in South Asia? To what extent could stakeholder involvement be incorporated? These are some of the questions I hope to tackle through the length of the project. This marks the end of my outline. I'm looking forward to having a vigorous and enlightening discussion with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you, Trisha. Hello, everyone. I am Srimeda, and I'm a senior researcher at the Parley project. The paper that I am working on addresses various tenets of coordinated inauthentic behavior, commonly known as CIB. CIB, as defined by Facebook, occurs when domestic non government campaigns that include groups of accounts and pages seek to mislead people about who they are and what they are doing through the use of fake accounts. This phenomenon occurred on a large scale during US election of 2016. Facebook, to tackle this, has taken measures to improve both inauthentic and authentic accounts, pages, and groups directly involved in this activity. To understand CIB better, the paper initially addresses certain basics associated with the phenomenon. We begin by understanding what psephology is and how psephology works by understanding elections, the population, interlinking data, and then micro-targeting it. We will then move on to understanding what data mining is and the impact of consolidation of digital technologies on data. For example, the common ownership of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp on data, or the impact of common ownership of Google, Alphabet, YouTube, Calico, etc. on data. Under this, we will also understand to what extent these platforms can exchange data and integrate it. We will then analyze the impact of this availability of data on psychology. We will then address the main issue, which is CIB, content monetization on social media platforms, under which we look for alternatives to content monetization for social media since they also require funding to function. In addition, we understand how it disrupts public opinion and basically through the lens of political psychology. Furthermore, we try to understand how it can be used as a tool for information warfare, thus becoming a threat to national security. Then we try to link CIB to elections and focus on legitimacy of a government coming to power by using it. And given the data mining and micro-targeting requires good amount of funding, does this not put smaller parties at a disadvantage, thus not creating a level playing field? Then the paper moves on to address the impact of CIB on India, wherein we touch upon the new IT rules and conclude by developing standard guidelines to help tackle CIB and micro-targeting by combating manipulation, misinformation, and data mining using AI in the best possible way. This is more or less a blueprint of my entire project, and I'm more than willing to take up any recommendations if the panelists have any. All right. I think we can move on to the first session then. Trisha,
Right,
please go ahead.
right. I think we can kick off. I would like to kick off the first session with a question to Kazim sir. Sir, within a decade of the spread of digitalization in the region, the state of digital rights in South Asia deteriorated rapidly and almost consistently across the region. What factors do you think are responsible for such uniformly restrictive behavior of South Asian governments?
So I think, looking at South Asian governments and specifically India per se, if you see in the last, I say, 10 years, with the rise of digitization, you're seeing that a lot of speech is now going online, right? So one is that with the rise of the internet, during pre-COVID times, I'm talking about, more and more public squares are now going online in online spaces, and you're seeing that physical spaces, it's sort of reducing in number, also in intensity. So a lot of the information, a lot of thought processes, a lot of influencing, political discussion, policy discussions are taking place online, and that's true for all South Asian regions. But predominantly, if we sort of talk about India, that's also true because with India, we've also seen a rapid rise of digitization and people using mobile phones to communicate with each other. So what we are witnessing in the last 10 years and post COVID, it's increased at a faster pace, is the fact that people are now using the online platforms specifically to come and opinionate, vent out their frustrations, their political inclinations, their beliefs, their ideologies, etc. So it's becoming an impending sort of important for governments to understand how this is functioning. And when it comes to narratives, building narratives, social media platforms are the key public squares when it comes to narrative building and also driving thought processes, right? That's the sort of the foundation or the base at which we are operating right now. Now, with the rise of tech and the importance or the critical importance of tech to influence thought process, there is an intersection of tech with fundamental rights and specifically with your question of right to speech. And people are deploying their ideas online. So right to speech in the online public square is becoming fundamental to your right to speech generally per se, because you're not seeing people going out and talking about or holding mass protests or mass gatherings anymore. And that's not true also for the lockdown period, because with the lockdown and post-COVID situation, a lot of that is now happening in the online space. So where are we right now as an institution or as a democracy is that the online speech becomes critical to your right to free speech, which is guaranteed by the Constitution under Article 19 and 21 for media as well. And so it's very important that this speech is protected. So that's first part of the aspect of speech. Now, at the same time, there is, of course, rise of fake news, disinformation, misinformation, which is taking place in these online spaces. And who defines what is fake news and misinformation? I think that's been the biggest challenge. A lot of the times you've seen fake news has been used as a construct to really sort of impact or sort of stifle speech as well, right? So it's very important to understand what do we mean by fake news, disinformation, misinformation campaigns which are being launched, how to sort of address those issues. So there is a national security problem. Now, is the national security problem so much that you should stifle speech? I think that's the question which people in the tech space are trying to grapple with. At this point of time, the right to speech is a fundamental right. Of course, national security is a big issue and you have to be able to address it. But there have to be reasonable restrictions. I mean, the restrictions cannot be unreasonable to curb a right to free speech in order to satisfy a national security objective of the government. So I think that's where the key problem lies. And we've seen governments talk about, security is important, security is critical. We have to make sure that, we are securing the nation. But the point is that security and speech can go together, hand in hand. You don't have to stifle speech to enhance or to push for national security. I think that's a debate which is also really finding resonance in India, especially with the new IT rules, which were just enact sort of became about notified a few months ago, and we've been talking a lot about it. That whether, let's say, for example, traceability on end-to-end encrypted platforms, whether you need to really enter or sort of break in the encryption of these platforms to be able to understand who is sending what message. Are there other tools to satisfy national security challenges? And it appears they are, right? If you talk to the intelligence community, if you talk to the people who've been there, done that, or the techies as well, there are many ways to be able to satisfy the national security objectives of the government when it comes to catching non-state actors or catching terrorists or catching whoever you want to, without actually having to impinge or stifle speech. One example on end-to-end encrypted devices is, let's say, metadata analysis. The other is, doing better forensic analysis, training your intelligence, your police officers. So a lot of these issues are actually fundamental institutional problems of Indian policing, of Indian security establishment, rather than the fact that you have to stifle speech because everybody is talking so much, and you have to sort of really limit speech of people in order to satisfy the security needs. That's not really necessary, right? Another issue is, you're looking at tools such as proactive monitoring or proactive takedown of content. Now, platforms or social media platforms which do this, they have been doing it anyway. But artificial intelligence-driven proactive monitoring is not accurate at all. It's not 100% accurate. It can be manipulated. It can be misled at many point of time. So what you end up doing is proactively removing content which may not be flagged as illegal or improper content in the first place, right? So that's another challenge which we are seeing. Then I think also, looking at criminal liability of these officials, of intermediaries, right? If you the whole issue around safe harbor, actual knowledge of safe harbor, sorry, actual knowledge pertaining to safe harbor. And if you take away safe harbor of platforms, and if you say that actual knowledge can come from a user herself, and the share single judgment is very clear. In 2015, the Supreme Court said that actual knowledge, where a platform is told that a particular speech is problematic or should be taken down, is illegal, should either come from the court or should come from the government. If you bring in the element of a user, which is against the Supreme Court judgment, and then you use that to tell a platform that, look, your safe harbor is taken away from you, now you are liable for the third party content posted on your platform, where do we end up with? We end up with over censorship on these platforms, right? And that's what is going to happen if we sort of really go this path. So I think these are some of the broad major issues when it comes to regulating the public squares we are living with. And I think there's a need for a debate to happen on what constitutes fake news, what constitutes misinformation. You cannot have broad overarching definitions of fake news, or it hurts the integrity of the country or security. What I mean, it's very broad. I think Arindrajit, being a lawyer, can speak about that. But you have to narrow down the definitions, which are not the case in the current IT rules at all. So what you do is you look at these definitions, you make it as overarching as possible, and then you sort of claim that, okay, contextualizing it to a problem, and you say, okay, fine, this is fake news because it comes under this particular heading. So I think we need to have a debate there. We need to have a debate of how to improve existing policing mechanisms rather than going after and collecting more and more data. Because when you look at right to privacy and fundamental right to privacy and the Puttaswamy judgment, any violation to privacy must be through a four-part test, which is necessity, illegality, proportionate. So it has to be proportionate. The data collected has to be proportionate. It has to be legal. It has to be necessary to the problem, which when you sort of asking for, let's say, trying to enter or trying to sort of ask for traceability may not be the case. Are there less intrusive means to access data? Maybe yes, there are. Are there ways to collect information and still find a sort of a pattern or a profile of a crime without having to break E2E encryption? Yes, there are. So I think we need to have a more technologically nuanced debate and then arrive at some sort of solutions, because I think at this rate we may not be able to either fulfill the security objectives and also end up stifling speech.
Absolutely, sir. I think that answers my question. So, alternatively, do you think China can become more of a threat somehow, with governments possibly modeling its digital protectionist and authoritative behavior?
Uh, China is not a threat to us in that case. I mean, but yeah, if you start modeling yourself on China, then it becomes a problem, because China is not a democracy. So I think that's very clear. But I think the question of China becoming a threat is more in the cybersecurity domain than the digital freedom domain, because I think with China, the bigger problem is around its hardware and the use of possible or potential Chinese 5G technology, and also the whole cyberspace ecosystem and the cyber attacks which we face as a nation again from China, which we face regularly. In fact, I think China and now North Korea are the two nations which attack India the most. So I think that's something which has to be addressed, but that's a different debate altogether.
Absolutely. I think that answers my question, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. My next question I would like to ask Mr. Baxi. Good evening, sir.
Yeah, good.
Good evening, sir. Sir, what do you believe, according to you, is the most important point of distinction between South Asia and South Asian countries and developed countries in their current needs for digital freedom? And how do you think that could be incorporated best in international regulatory measures?
I'll start the answer by carrying on what Kazim said. And he mentioned that, especially in the post COVID situation, and because of the general digitization of the country's demographics, town halls, public squares, and mass protests moved online. Uh, but when you have to when the government wants to avoid a mass protest in a physical setting, there is a section 144 that they can put out. There are curfews that they can put out, and to avoid or break that flow of people gathering together for good or bad, whatever be the case. But that is not something that's present online. And unless there is a certain kind of stifling of speech or shutting down of platforms. That would not be the case on a digital platform. What we have to understand that in the developed countries or across the world, there is a disproportion of real life rights, human rights, and legal rights, depending on the country that you live in, and your constitutional structure. India does not have a data privacy law. European nations have data privacy laws. So we can't look at digital rights as an international regulation which is uniform. We can't emulate those models which have been established in some other country, be it a developed democracy like the United States or a country like China. It is very hard to emulate a setup or an ecosystem of digital rights and just replicate it in India with our constitution, with our expectations of common citizens and the legal rights available to them. The digital rights have to be formed around that. And so there's a gulf between legal rights and general freedom that an Indian citizen has in the country with many other countries. So we can't look for absolute digital freedom when we don't have those freedoms in real life. Since we can take the example of OTT streaming, and there have been issues where some shows or some films have been one protested against, and then there have been police complaints or court cases upon them, while there is no censorship, so to say, on the digital medium. So while legally the OTT platform was in compliance, airing something that they deemed fit, but because of the laws of the land and because of how the judicial setup is and how the also a lot of hooliganism around it function, the OTT they face a challenge and everything that went about it. So there has to be a because there is a dissonance between digital rights and the legal rights on the ground. There has to be a bit of synchronization between the two, and which cannot be emulated in a very standard global way.
All right, sir. Thank you. I think that answers my question.
My first question is to Mr. Arindrajit Basu. I think even Mr. Kazim Rizvi can add on to this. So, do you think making social media platforms share more information could prove counterproductive in a country where citizens still do not have a data privacy law to guard themselves against excesses committed by any party? How do you think we can tackle this issue without a data privacy law?
Good question. I think first we need to note that hopefully we will have a data protection law sometime soon, hopefully this year. So to answer your question directly, I mean, ideally, no. I mean, if the fact that we don't have a data protection law, particularly when it comes to sensitive data, and the existing law that does exist, the sensitive data protection rules under the SPDI rules under the IT Act aren't enough to actually either provide a protective framework or to enforce it adequately. So the answer to your question is no, ideally we shouldn't be sharing data with any private platform till there is some sort of accountability measure imposed on them. What we do have in terms of the law of the land is what Kazim already mentioned, which was the fact that the right to privacy is a core component of the fundamental rights architecture in India, and there is the Puttaswamy judgment. So ideally, no, we shouldn't be sharing our data, but the point is that we are, and we have to exist. So I think, just to kind of put a different spin to your question, I think assuming that we've seen like a couple of versions of the data protection bill, when that becomes law, would that be enough to protect digital rights in India and protect users and consumers? So of course we don't know what the final version of the law will look like, but assuming that what we have seen so far will largely be carried forward, I thought I'll prepare a set of responses based on that, because I mean the answer to your question simply is that ideally we shouldn't be sharing our data, but like what to do, right? So just on that, I think on the law itself, just 4 quick points. One is that in terms of regulating private platforms, I think the law as it stands, in terms of the obligations they impose on private players, I think is fairly extensive. It's modeled on the GDPR in the EU, and for the most part, it does impose fairly some private players argue too onerous compliance obligations. So they say that the experience of the GDPR shows us that compliance obligations are too much, particularly for smaller players, and whether that needs to be reevaluated. Of course, the response to that is that if you are handling user data, then you should be having a certain bare minimum standard of protection. So, but I felt that it overall, in terms of the bill itself, in terms of the obligations they impose on private players in terms of notice and consent, is sufficient. The problems, or what we need to be talking about even after the law comes into place with regard to whether we should be sharing our data or not, are a few things. One is government driven surveillance, both by the Indian government and by other governments. So in terms of the Indian government, this isn't something that is limited to the data protection bill itself, but there is a series of laws that have existed since before independence, through the Telegraph Act and so on, which are then carried on in the digital age, which obviously isn't enough to account for the kind of surveillance that is possible today, which simply wasn't possible before. And there is an urgent need to update India's surveillance regime. One possible way of doing that would have been to actually ensure that, for the most part, any government entity, whether it is intelligence agencies or policing agencies or otherwise, at least to a large extent, are brought under the purview of the Personal Data Protection Bill. But what this bill does is that it provides a fairly vast exemption to any government entity. It's not fairly vast. It's basically whenever the government considers it necessary or expedient, then this exemption applies, which is, Kazim mentioned the Puttaswamy standard, and the human rights law standard is proportionality, whereas the bill actually uses the term expedient, which doesn't actually have any legal jurisprudence to back it up. So I think the concern that continues to exist, even if that law or when that law comes into force, is surveillance, one, by the Indian government, and second, that's something that you've already referred to, which is by foreign governments. And China is one that is known for conducting a variety of surveillance measures, both within its territory, but also by inserting backdoors and in equipment that is sold by Chinese vendors. But the other big player that we don't talk about maybe as often we do talk about, but generally gets subsumed under the China thing, is the US and the Five Eyes, which we were having a discussion before the panel started. So US has the most extensive extraterritorial surveillance scheme, I think, out of all countries in the world. It links up with private players, and the Snowden, if you get a chance to see the Snowden revelations and the slides that it denoted, very vast, kind of almost unfettered access to data that we share with private players, and almost no legal safeguards. And despite it being 8 years since the Snowden revelations, there are now more protections for US citizens. But for people like us living abroad, very few protections in US law, even though a lot of people have argued that it doesn't comply with international human rights. So even if we have that data protection bill, does it protect us from surveillance by our government or by foreign governments? That's another question to be explored. In fact, foreign surveillance was just, for reference, it was one of the reasons provided by the Sri Krishna committee that it kind of prepared the original draft. But again, domestic surveillance is another concern. The final quick point is on competition law. So even if we have data privacy protections, there is an independent strand of thinking that needs to go into devising competition law frameworks, because even if you protect privacy, it still doesn't get us past the fact that the social media platforms that are the big, say, Facebook or WhatsApp, for example, they benefit from something which are called network effects, which is that I use WhatsApp because there are, say, 500 of my friends and contacts who are on WhatsApp. Therefore, for me to start using another platform, and now I use Signal or Telegram more, a number of my friends and contacts would also need to shift to the other network. So unless my network shifts with me along to another platform, the dominant platform continues to benefit from network effects. And it's very difficult to break these network effects because of the entrenchment of a number of limited players. So we need new competition law frameworks, for example, calling out the WhatsApp forced kind of sharing of data with Facebook. Of course, it's a privacy concern. It's also a competition law concern because it undermines user choice, and the CCI is looking at that right now. So yeah, I know that I went a little bit off script in terms of your question, but I hope that provided some more thinking that I hope is useful for your writing in this project going forward.
Definitely, sir. So my next question is to Ms. Tarunima Prabhakar. Ma'am, there's a thin line between using AI to enhance user experience as opposed to data monetization and selling of data. Given that social media platforms need money to run, we've recognized that content monetization through micro-targeting is unethical. So do you think they can milk that money directly from users? If not, how else will they function?
Great, thanks. I think you're asking a fairly challenging question about the economics of. Not all of internet service, like not all big internet companies, but at least the two big ones are Google and Facebook, right? So to back up a little bit, I think targeting has always happened. If you go to the, on the Delhi Metro, if you go to the women's coach, you'll see advertisements that are targeted towards women, right? Like the language is written for women. And so this is something that's historically happened. I think what's the challenge has become that the targeting has become very, very specific. And even when you talk to people who do digital marketing, they'd often say that a few things, even between Google and Facebook, their experience with something like Facebook is a lot better because in some ways the targeting is a lot more tailored to individual preferences in a way that Google search is not, Google ads are not, right? So from marketing professionals' perspective, the micro targeting is great. It helps them like target more people in a smaller budget, get to the right people in a smaller budget. Unfortunately, like we've obviously that what has ended up happening is that the micro targeting has had a lot of inadvertent or sometimes deliberate deleterious effects in terms of like the conversation about the Macedonian teens basically targeting information because it was giving them money, because a couple of folks or people, the populations in America were clicking on these ads. So I think there's definitely like a challenge to micro-targeting that we're recognizing. But I did want to preface by saying that targeting has often happened. Maybe the conversation right now is about the scale of just how granular this has become, right? And there has been pushback on this. So a lot of it has come from, for example, ProPublica's reporting of saying that how the targeting on, let's say, religious categories, on racial categories violates national laws in the US, right? So now Facebook used to allow you to target based on, let's say, your ethnicity, and now it does not. And in fact, even if you're in India and you're trying to create some of these ads, we are governed by the same laws that Facebook is governed by in the US. So I, as an individual, can also not create, sitting in India, cannot create some of these ads based on ethnic categories, right? So I think some of these trends are moving towards less granular, so slightly coarser targeting, and that might be a better balance because I don't think that having an advertisement in a coffee shop is not the same as having an advertisement to a person, right? Like the fear with micro targeting was that we weren't even being able to tell how people were being targeted, and it was interfering with, in some ways, like transparency of like how information was being pushed to individuals. Now, in terms of like what are alternate business models, there's a really interesting theory by Jaron Lanier, and his theory is that the reason why we got to this model of the internet where you want really big sort of successful platforms, but users don't pay for it is incoherent combination of the sort of open source movement ideals of like how platforms and infrastructures should be open and free, but mixed with the sort of libertarian slash like deification of big tech entrepreneurs in the US, right? So on one hand, you want there like the open source ideas where everything must be free, but at the same time, there's at least in some places there's a aspiration and glorification of like people being very successful, making a lot of money, and when you mix both of those, you land up creating a toxic mix where you want companies that have 70% share increases, right? So like post Cambridge Analytica, even after Cambridge Analytica, like Facebook's share prices have increased by 70%, right? And if like Twitter's share prices don't increase, the shareholders get mad at the activist board members say like let's get rid of Jack Dorsey because that's sort of become the model of businesses, right? And so you have that, and at the same time it's combined with this aspiration that's or these values that a lot of these services must be free, because in some ways it's like a noble good. So like Facebook's the original idea of like we must connect individuals, right? Or like we are connecting, that was their initial goal, right? So it's a toxic mix of wanting things to be free, but also like having like behemoths and having people become very rich and successful in the process. And his so Jaron Lanier's claim is like you have to pick one or the other, you can't have both. And I think that's an interesting idea, because you can have social media platforms that don't return, don't give you like a 30% rate of return on your shares, and I think that's fine. The problem is like the VC model has sort of made that a bad thing or a bad way for a business to operate. So in terms of alternatives, we're definitely seeing things, like the federated social networks. That's a move to sort of remove some of the centralization. There are ideas around, there are entities like newsrooms who are trying to experiment with get rid of Google Analytics or Facebook ads altogether, but try and do your own in-house, but like more coarse advertisements, say, let's just say based on location, right? And seeing what that gives to you. And then, of course, I think platforms are consistently trying new, even some of the established platforms are trying like new ideas around, can you do in-app purchases, and rather than trying to target people with specific advertisements and information. So I think it's a fairly complicated answer, but I do think that the economics of the internet, or what we have convinced is like a good way for businesses to operate, is to a large extent at fault as well.
That completely answers my question. We'll move on to the second session then, which is more or less based on digital divide. So my first question here is to Mr. Abhishek Baxi. So CIB is a malicious attempt to target and mislead people. In such a situation, how can CIB be developed as a tool for information warfare, thus becoming a threat to national security? Alongside, given that political micro-targeting and psychology requires funding, does this not put small parties at a disadvantage? In such a situation, do you think it places all parties at a same platform for the race?
Well, this question is a few years late anyway. We've seen how elections have been affected. The US elections was the first one that gained limelight. We've seen that in Indian elections. And when I say Indian elections, I don't mean only the general elections, but also the assembly elections that follow up in the states. While we do not have core evidence of Cambridge Analytica type activity happening here. But what is evident is that this coordinated and authentic behavior has been at play in elections for. This was a thing with Donald Trump's election, and he's finished his entire tenure. So we are a few years late into this question. Yes, this has been a threat. It places smaller parties at a disadvantage, and smaller parties have always been at a disadvantage. Back in the day, it was only an economic or a financial disadvantage, and there were richer parties which had the means and the muscle to pull off campaigns, to many rallies, and do a zillion other things. But And which is why election commission formed some regulations around the money that can be spent on elections, what constitutes a political rally, what does not constitute one. So there were safeguards for election commission. Of course, we can argue that a lot of that in practice does not really happen, does not stand test of the rules. But in case of this inauthentic behavior, one, this is hugely funded. We've seen in India how certain parties are quite rich, quite finance, and there has been an issue about the election bonds that fund a lot of parties in a non-transparent manner, and all that can go to these platforms for building that kind of misinformation network, or drive platforms towards this platform users towards these inauthentic behavior. And I guess again, we do not have the election commission which is evolved to a manner which can safeguard this. I mean, at this point, we are still debating, as Kazim pointed out, what is fake news, what is misinformation. Then the IT rules come into the place to fix accountability on that on that front. So it will take a little time before the election ecosystem, uh, the entire way how democratic elections happen in the country, in India and elsewhere, kind of have a counter to the coordinated inauthentic behavior on social media platform. At this point, there is misinformation or propaganda or fake news every day uh, for a zillion types of events. Elections is just one part of it. So while we have checks and balances for this kind of behavior online, is when we can reach at a stage where an election commission or the government of India can take certain measures to avoid this happening in elections. And then there's the role of big tech and these platforms. That there have been certain steps by Facebook in the US, but we've seen a lot of examples that those haven't been followed up with similar gusto in India about transparency of the advertisers of political ads and things like that. But those haven't been replicated in India and elsewhere.
So I think you muted yourself by mistake.
Sorry,
Yeah,
am I
you
good?
could.
Yeah. Uh, we've seen a lot of steps taken by big tech and these platforms like Facebook in the US, but those haven't been replicated in India or elsewhere. Like transparency of ads, lack of political ads on in certain manner, that hasn't been replicated in India. In fact, on the contrary, we've seen a lot of political pages, a lot of propaganda channels on these platforms that have dispersed and peddled misinformation or propaganda without any disclaimers, and they continue to thrive. So this is a problem which has to be tackled broadly and not just from an electioneering point of view, because we're too early to kind of fix these things before we can have fair elections, so to say. Until that time, like in the old days, the smaller parties will continue to be at a disadvantage. Independent candidates will always be at a disadvantage because while they always had the worry of the fighting against the money and the muscle of larger parties, but they now also have to deal with something like this.
Completely agreed, sir. Trisha?
I would like to direct my question to Kazim sir. Sir, this is something that Mr. Bakshi sir already touched upon a little bit. So what factors do you believe could be central deterrents to any form of international cooperation for the regulation of digital freedom in South Asia? And how do you feel we can effectively get past that at this point?
So, do you mean deterrence of global cooperation or in like countries doing it on their own?
First, just international cooperation for deterioration of digital freedom in these countries. Maybe a framework, a regional framework, maybe, or a global framework, perhaps. So,
Yeah.
what do you think could be a barrier to maybe any kind of resolution coming about in that case?
Okay, so I think at this stage in the UN, we have a body which looks at digital freedoms, and there is a body which sort of talks about it. And recently, we saw the UN Rapporteur's report on the Indian IT rules, where it was very clear coming in from the UN that the IT rules are a problem, both for security and privacy. So ideally, the UN should be looking at this. But yes, I think there is a time now to sort of look at cooperation when it comes to digital freedoms. But seeing that because that may not be a very high priority on the agenda of countries itself. In the cyberspace, we've seen cooperation on cyber warfare. We've seen cooperation of cyber security or cyber diplomacy or international data transfers. But when it comes to digital freedoms, we have seen less cooperation because maybe that's not as high a priority, or maybe the countries are convinced that there is enough they can do on a individual level, on a unilateral level as a nation, to not need a cooperation on digital freedoms. Ideally, the UN should be looking at it. It is looking at it, but it's also something which is not very high on the radar when it comes to countries dealing with each other diplomatically. And case in hand is China, right? China has no digital freedoms, but everybody trades with China, right? US is the biggest trading partner of China, but doesn't matter to them because China doesn't have any freedom, and doesn't matter to the US government because they will still trade with China. So I think, I mean, you can call it whatever you may, but the situation is such that on a cooperative level, on a multilateral level, even on a bilateral level, actually, digital freedoms may not rank as high a priority as opposed to cyber security, cyber diplomacy. But at the same time, it is a critical element when it comes to civil rights organizations talking about it. When it comes to press freedom, it is a critical element for journalists, for a lot of governments when they talk to each other. It is an issue which is highlighted more on a bilateral level than a multilateral level. And we've seen a lot of agencies coming out and rating the press freedom index or the press freedom reports, or even the UN Rapporteur report, or maybe there are other reports as well which rate the freedom of expression, or the availability of freedom for an individual to opinionate on what he or she wants to. But it's more to do with organizations, civil rights organizations, civil society, which do that work globally, rather than countries coming together and forming an alliance of some sorts. Um, the reasons also, I think, are because it's not a commercial, there is no commercial output to it. So there is, I mean, you don't, in terms of a multilateral approach, countries may not spend too much time on it because they may not get anything out of it. But when it comes to security, for safeguarding borders or for trade deals, there is a clear tangible output you see. So I think that's also one more reason why there isn't much cooperation happening, at least open multilateral cooperation not happening. There is an argument for the UN to do more than it does. There is an argument to sort of talk about, okay, look, what kind of internet freedom index do we have? One, I don't know if we have an internet freedom index right now when it comes to privacy, when it comes to speech. But yes, I do understand that the EU doesn't or wouldn't do trade, or wouldn't let's say, have an advocacy arrangement with a country if the standards of human rights or standards of privacy are not on a threshold which is considered by EU as a basic threshold of guaranteeing civil rights and human rights to the people of a country. For example, let's suppose if India wants to sign a data transfer agreement with the EU as part of a free trade agreement, which will be discussed in the future, in the coming months. Or let's say if India wants to sign a Cloud Act agreement with the US, which constitutes the fact that India and US can now share data with each other. Data transfers can take place between both countries for law enforcement purpose. That can only happen if India qualifies a minimum threshold of human rights, or minimum threshold of privacy is guaranteed. If that doesn't happen, then India would not get the advocacy arrangement with the EU or the US, and that will limit India's commercial interest. So only when you are attaching or linking rights with commercial interests or commercial output would you look, or would nations would sort of start taking it seriously. So now what we see in the privacy bill in the parliament is that India is according, or trying to accord sort of a minimum privacy right to the people through the sort of different stages of data collection, processing, storage, profiling, bringing in different concepts of privacy by design, etc., to make sure that India has a law which is harmonized with a global privacy regime of the EU or the US, for example. I mean, US doesn't have, but states have. So the idea is that you establish a very sort of base level privacy regime. Only then would you be able to capitalize or monetize on international data transfers, trade deals, etc. And that will also accord a lot of advantages to Indian businesses, Indian corporates, and Indian organizations which are involved with this kind of work, where they are sort of into the tech space, creating products and services. So there is a lot of work happening when it comes to bilateral agreements. There is some work happening, but on a multilateral level, you can argue Convention 108 or the Budapest Convention also talks about minimum privacy thresholds. If you want to be part of those convention, once you're part of those convention, you are giving a you basically are able to capitalize on data transfers from different countries, which allows your tech ecosystem to build products, build services, and create more efficient products, which can be then sold to the market.
Definitely, sir. I think that answers my question. And you've given me some wonderful insights. Thank you.
My next question is again to Ms. Prabhakar. Ma'am, when an individual joins a social media platform, they often tend to agree to certain rules and regulations. Additionally, advertisements do provide disclaimers, but users often tend to overlook them. Under such circumstances, how do we prevent penetration of data into people's privacy, and how do we obstruct users from leaving digital traces, thus ensuring that there's no algorithmic processing?
So I think one thing is that we've emphasized a little too much on notice and consent as a framework for ensuring or pretending that it protects consumer interest on the internet, whereas there's enough evidence from behavioral economics to show that notice and consent don't work just because of the information fatigue, right? You want a service immediately. All your friends are on it. The cost of not agreeing to the terms and condition at that moment can seem really high, whereas the costs are also very difficult to evaluate because the privacy harms or the data collection harms accrue over multiple years and might hit you like 5 years later when there's a data breach of sorts, right? So it's in general, what I'm trying to get to is that it's very difficult for an individual to assess and estimate what they are really trading off in all of these notice and consent frameworks, right? So from my perspective, I think, and that's why we are where we are, like the internet worked just fine on disclosure statements for multiple years till we realized 5 years back that it wasn't enough. And so I think we are already a little late in this. I mean, not late. I think we are at the right point in this conversation that there is an I do think like sometimes an over enthusiasm to regulate. With the recognition that these disclosure frameworks are no longer effective, right? So I don't have an easy answer to say how can we prevent or protect users better from sometimes agreeing into these terms. I think regulation of the sorts we are, at least the motivation is to say that, okay, states must or companies must be limited by law in what they can and cannot do, because we know that individuals aren't always in the best place to make these decisions. And so the meteor discussion is what is the right shape for those laws. But I don't think that's like I think we could have another 2-hour discussion on that. So I'll pause, and if you have any counter questions, do let me know.
I completely agree with you, ma'am. There's no given solution for this, but can we ensure that this intrusion into people's privacy is not just ensured for the rich sections of society or the elite sections of the society, but also the poorer sections of the society?
Right. So maybe what I'm sensing from your question is the view expressed by I guess some entrepreneurs, some philanthropists, some sections of the government, that data can be used to trade for services. I guess in the context of my own research, data can be used to access credit. So that's one example. But yeah, just generally can be used data for accessing health services, financial services. And I think, again, this is, in some cases, things, it really, to me, comes down to the sector and also the culture and the sort of cultural norms, societal norms of a country, right? So in the American context, trading any personal data for financial services is going to be a big no-no because of their history with racial discrimination. And so, in fact, it is interesting that the laws that are now being applied to predictive analytics are actually were not designed for the systems. They were designed for a very different context, came out of the civil rights movement. but actually are now serving as a good background for regulating predictive analytics or datafication, as you were describing it. But then when you come to India, we don't have those laws. We haven't particularly been concerned with targeting based on your minority status or your identity, just because constitutionally we've taken a very different approach. So India's approach has been of affirmative action, and that means that the sort of discrimination that prediction and datafication leads to has not, at least we don't have enough jurisprudence to actually, I don't know if Arindrajit, you're going to disagree with me on this, but I think relative to the US, there's lesser, right? And so we are a little bit caught in the blind, and we don't have, we're actually having debates we're having debates in some ways for the first time because of these technical systems. So I have my personal opinion, and I think it also again depends from sector to sector. I think in some sectors, trading data for services is a complete no-no. But I think at the same time, I recognize that people's preferences vary. I might be willing to share, I might be willing to sign up on Facebook where my friend might not be willing to sign up on Facebook. And that is also a difference in preferences for what we want to, what we are okay accepting for exchange of our data, right? So yeah, I think there's room for both, in that there's room for yeah, like depending on the sector, I think we need to have like specific discussions about whether that datafication is fair or not. I'm not going to say that there should be a blanket statement saying that no, because there is different people may value their privacy differently, we should outlaw any kind of data exchange in lieu of services.
Thank you, ma'am. I think that answers my question.
Right. I would like to direct my next question to Mr. Basu. Sir, so digital regional frameworks, in particular those protecting digital freedom in South Asia, have been vague and unenforceable to a large extent. Why do you feel that is, and how do you think that can be dealt with?
So just to clarify, by regional frameworks, do you mean like the domestic laws, or kind of regional frameworks that are agreed to between
right, sir. Regional
countries
framework,
in
for
South
example,
Asia?
the ASEAN Human Rights Charter, maybe. So, right.
No, perfect. So yeah, so that's a very useful question. So I think the first thing to kind of unpack there is why are we looking at all at South Asia as a region, right? And I thought when I saw your questions, I started thinking about that. What's the point of looking at from the perspective of digital freedoms? Why at all look at this group of like 4 or 7 countries that I suppose you could, the formal alliance between them is SAARC, but they are located similarly geographically. And then I started thinking about kind of where these countries are in terms of their own national stories have important similarities and differences. So where they are in terms of how they're engaging with non-state actors, which includes both, say, like adversarial non-state actors like terrorist groups, or in the cyber domain, non-state actors, either cyber criminals or other more sophisticated, possibly state-sponsored threats. How they are engaging with other countries outside the region. So when you look at how they're engaging with China, the US, the kind of alliances they're entering. Again, the stories are similar, but also different in certain cases. And of course, there is the other question of the evolution of the political systems within each of these countries that is obviously fairly unique. So when we look at South Asia as a region, and we look at how the story of these 7 or 10 countries are evolving, and then of course how they are engaging with countries a little bit outside the region, like for example ASEAN countries and so on. I think it brings to light a few kind of similarities and differences. So obviously the differences are in terms of where each of these countries are located, in terms of their own economic and constitutional path. And of course, how they're engaging with the outside world. So if you look at India, for example, India was invited to as an observer at the recent G7 that happened in Cornwall, right, out at Caribbean. In fact, there were 2 statements that came out of that. Both referred to internet freedoms in a certain context. One was only signed by the G7 countries, and then there were 4 the Open Society statement that was signed by the G7 countries and 4 others. So which included India. So, of course, on that, there was a reference to digital rights in the sense that internet shutdowns were condemned, although if you, based on reporting, it appears that the original language was tweaked upon India's insistence. So it's also about how these countries are engaging with other frameworks, with other alliances and other frameworks. So therefore, to look at your question in terms of why we don't have stronger regional frameworks for cooperation, the answer is pretty much, I think Kazim's already answered it largely, but it's largely because the priorities of countries are driven by usually security and economic imperatives. And then that's generally where, through engagement through economic and security imperatives, the rights-based framework comes in through that. So within, again, when we look at South Asia, there are unique constitutional frameworks that India, for example, has. And I'm interested to see how these constitutional frameworks are then transmitted into the regional frameworks that bind these countries together. So when you look at when you look at India's constitutional framework, for example, it has a unique blend of both civil liberties and economic and social empowerment. And as Tarunima mentioned, it's not actually been translated enough into the digital, both like court decisions as well as kind of government decisions on technology policy, right? So in that sense, India's constitutional framework is not slightly, it's actually greatly different from the US constitutional framework, which both are obviously what are politically called democracies, but US is very much focused on the protection of individual rights. Just if you look at how the US Constitution evolved, it evolved at a time when basically there were a limited number of generally rich, wealthy, slave-owning men who were looking to protect themselves from the long arm of the British state, whereas the Indian Constitution evolved after a period of protracted struggle. And you should read Gautam Bhatia's work on this in his book called The Transformative Constitution. So I think the question for us to therefore look at is that how are domestic constitutional priorities within key countries in the region, to what extent are they translating into regional conversations? So when we look at regional agreements, I think that largely cooperation should happen at the international level. I'm a little bit skeptical of to the extent to which regional like binding treaties will lead to change. I think what is much more important is kind of exchange and just sharing of best practices and so on. So when we look, so can we, if we were to have a SARC human rights framework, just because the countries are so different from each other, I find it difficult to imagine how a binding framework in that sense would be useful. But kind of honest conversations both about the domestic original constitutional frameworks, how those constitutional frameworks are being implemented, challenges that non-state actors, civil society are facing, and really using regional fora as a way to exchange views, and then where these views converge, negotiating at global platforms such as the United Nations. And Kazim's already mentioned, I think, a number of platforms that are within the UN that is looking at measures of cooperation on digital freedoms, but they're largely, again, being driven by security. But I will mention that at the UN First Committee, which looks at disarmament and international security, there was a report put forward by what is known as the UN Group of Governmental Experts, which is one, they're trying to create norms for responsible behavior in cyberspace. There was a recent report, last month, that was put out. And they actually refer to human rights in that report. Even though that it's a committee focused on security of the UNGA, they refer to human rights and actually call out mass surveillance as a practice that's unacceptable. So I think that, while it should be multilateral, it will be driven by security and economic concerns. States are waking up to the fact that in cyberspace, you can't segregate the two artificially, because if your privacy is threatened online, or you are not sure whether a surveillance may be conducted on you, then you're less likely to feel secure in your use of information and communication technology. So I think that there is that convergence as well. So yeah, I hope that answered your question somewhat. I don't think regional frameworks are necessarily the answer, at least binding regional frameworks, but I do hope that regional fora such as SARC, and if you extend that a little bit, ASEAN, or extend that a little bit, the APAC region, can serve as a forum for exchanging best practices and having conversations around some of these concepts.
Right, absolutely. Thank you, sir. I think that really helped. That answers my question. I think we can move on to session 3.
Yeah. So for session 3, I think my first question is to Mr. Kazim. So tech companies are buying out their competitors, ensuring greater access and monopoly of data. For example, Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram through common ownership, and again, Alphabet, Google, and YouTube. So to what extent do you think they can exchange data, and how is it harmful for the end users with respect to their privacy?
Yeah. So I think that's a big competition debate which is taking place globally now. And in the tech space over the last 20 years, we've seen that, if you can't compete, then you buy your competitor, and then the competitor is sort of subsumed within the larger entity. And then the entity becomes bigger and bigger. And that also sort of enhances the network effect, which was discussed earlier also in the discussion. So what we are seeing, and where digital business models operate differently from traditional business models, is because the winner takes all point of view here. Because if everybody is on, let's say, a particular messaging app, then it's very difficult for somebody new to come in and break through and sort of really create a name for themselves, unless until your service is far better, or you're giving a protection or privacy which is much more advanced than it is for the existing platform. So I think what we are seeing is the rise of networks. Now, of course, there are good things, bad things, ugly things of these networks and how they operate. Obviously, it's good for a lot of commercial interest, maybe, but it may not be good for people who or entrepreneurs who want to set up something which competes with them. So that's one aspect of networks which operate right now. And obviously, monopolization of these networks can lead to challenging equations with the civil rights movement, which is what we are seeing globally as well. So countries are now responding to it, or trying to respond to it, through competition laws and competition commissions. And of course, the CCI in India is also looking into this issue actively, is whether these monopolies or tech giants or the big techs are actually violating competition norms. So that's one debate which is taking place. The other is around privacy, and privacy as a competition harm is also being discussed very actively in the EU, in Germany, in England. In the EU is being discussed very actively right now, whether privacy as a competition harm is taking place or not. I think one key element here is understanding the fact that you need a regulation which protects the privacy of the user and which responds to the evolving digital business models as what we are seeing right now. And unfortunately, in India, we don't have such laws which can protect us from, let's say, companies maybe sharing data with each other, or monopolies becoming bigger and sort of really having super control when it comes to profiling and data gathering and data collection, which they do, basis which they have much more information and much more insights, and therefore they are much more powerful. Now, what you need is an answer from a regulatory standpoint, which we don't have at this moment, which is why we saw that, the whole debate around, okay, whether you're sharing data or not internally or not with companies are doing it with each other. Do we have a privacy law which protects us from it? No, it doesn't, because we don't have a law at a place right now. So I think that's one issue which we have to tackle. GDPR does protect with this, which is why in the GDPR, the WhatsApp privacy policy operates differently, because there is a very clear demarcation that, look, don't share it with Facebook XYZ. Now there is an argument to say, okay, fine, how does it impact in real life? That's a different argument. But then the laws are there, and that's why the organization has to cooperate with the regulatory regime. In India, that's not the case. So I think what we need right now is greater answers around competition issues arising out of big tech. Are we creating super monopolies? That's another question which we have to answer. And what are the laws which we need to actually be able to make sure that, look, is user privacy being protected or not? What is the level of data sharing happening? Why are companies sharing data? Is there a operational requirement? Is it a commercial requirement? So I think those answers have to be very clear. And when it comes to sort of sharing data also, I think it's critical to see whether it violates your right to privacy or not. And I think there it's critical to understand how do you collect, process, store all the sort of life cycle of data from the moment the data is collected to it's used, and then it's whether it's deleted or not with the parent entity. I think those questions have to be asked, and I don't know if those questions are being asked right now in the Indian data protection regime, because we haven't seen the light of the day with the data protection bill, right? And now we have a new chairperson coming in, so we don't know when it will get passed. Arinjit is hopeful this year. I am not sure that it will get passed this year. I can put my money on it. It won't get passed this year. Maybe, I mean, I really want it to be passed in July and August, because see, I think the point is that when you start, and I think this is not just a monopoly issue. This has always been the problem with any commercial entity which becomes a little big. They are they collecting more data than required, right? And it's not just a WhatsApp, Facebook issue. It's becoming an issue with every tech organization, where we are seeing that. And there are organizations which don't even give you their privacy policy. There are organizations you don't even know how much data are they collecting, whether they are selling it to third parties or not. So transparency is completely gone for a toss in the Indian tech ecosystem. And I'm not sure when it comes to, I mean, it's good that at least you're telling us, okay, you're collecting data and you're sharing it with XYZ entity. There are organizations which don't do that as well. So it's not just one issue. There are many problems with the entire business model of the tech ecosystem when it comes to the fact. I think Tarunima spoke of the fact that you're not paying for your service, so you're just giving up your information and your data. And what happens is you don't know where it lands. You don't know what happens to it. You don't know what kind of profiling is happening around you, which app you're using. I mean, there have been many controversies around certain apps when it comes to facial recognition, and they were creating some sort of modeling. They were using photos of a lot of other people, putting it together, pairing it, and coming up with some weird ideas around your personality. I don't know. I mean, it was a year ago or something. I can't remember exactly which application it was. Now we are seeing the rise of new entities, like Clubhouse. Everybody is on Clubhouse, but I don't know what Clubhouse does with all those recorded conversations. What's happening? They delete it, they store it for a while, but their privacy policy is very vague, right? And this is just the beginning. So I mean, there's a lot to debate around this, but largely what we need is a privacy law at this point of time.
Right. So I think those are some great insights, and I really hope the law comes to light soon. Trisha.
My next question would be for Tarunima, ma'am. Ma'am, across the world, we see private entities, especially social networks, play a role in the regulation and even protection sometimes of digital rights. Do you feel social networks have the leverage to play that kind of role in South Asian countries? And do you think the movement for the regulation and protection of digital freedom would benefit from a more active involvement of these entities?
I'm going to first say that social networks are not just the American social networks, right? We also have social networks in India, some of whom are now new unicorns. And we definitely, they definitely have a buy-in with the Indian government. And I think India is interested in, for the right reasons, in protecting its domestic economy, but that also means it's sort of supporting national players, and that means that they do have a fair bit of influence in some of these conversations, right? And I think it's interesting to me that a lot of these conversations have not received a lot of publicity, and we focus so much on the big tech platforms, of course, because they do have a lot of users. But it is important to remember Twitter has only 15 million users. A lot of the Indian platforms have over, the TikToks, no, not the TikToks, Takatak, ShareChat, Moj, and there's one more. Like they have over 100 million users. And so what's happening on these platforms is completely under the radar for all of us, right? The other thing is, since you said South Asia, not India, in our neighboring countries, there's a lot of role of China and Chinese platforms / government, where they are supporting countries with technical infrastructure, so down to cables, optical cables, and the switches that are needed to run the internet. They're supporting with that. This is, of course, in conjunction to the physical infrastructure that China is supporting in some of these countries. They're also supporting with the technical infrastructure to run the internet, but then they're also supporting with the sort of social platforms, right? So TikTok, for example, is banned in India, but it's still very popular in Pakistan. And a lot of these platforms obviously then have sway because there are economic interests tied, and then with China, the state and the industry work so closely together. So I think a lot of these platforms, through either just the private channel networks or through the state networks, have a fair bit of influence in these regulatory conversations in other countries as well. Now, the question is, I don't think that means that a lot of the civil society in these countries is inactive. Like, people there and the government in Pakistan also has a tussle with TikTok in terms of what it does allow and does not allow on the platforms, right? So I think that tussle is always there. But yeah, just to say that let's look beyond just let's say the Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApps of the world, and realize that yes, all platforms, all industries that are, all private sectors that are operating in these spaces are trying to influence regulation, often for their own interests, and that it makes a lot of sense to me. I understand why they're doing this, right? Now, whether or not this is a generative conversation, I think you can't have a conversation by leaving the platforms out. There's just too much information asymmetry between what is actually happening inside, and also to realize that information asymmetry means that if platforms are not on in some of these conversations, we are possibly going to make fairly ill-intentioned regulations, right? So of course, it's like civil society has been saying that, or academics have been saying that you cannot break encryption, or you cannot have traceability because that will change the architecture of WhatsApp. But clearly, WhatsApp also has to be a part of this conversation when a government tells it to break traceability, right? You can't just have the government. And so I think having platforms be a part of this conversation is necessary. What I think has happened, though, is that in our angst and anxiety about big tech, the conversation is either about governments and big tech, and I think what needs to happen is that there has to be a bigger role for civil society, even in this regulatory discussion, right? So even when we talk about platforms and we talk about regulation of social media, a lot of it has landed up being like government should either do this or platforms should do this. I think what we haven't spoken about enough is what are the alternative imaginations for platforms that allow for greater public participation or for greater, I would say, public ownership / influence, right? So you have that. I think you have you're sort of seeing trickles of that. I don't think it's become mainstream, at least in like the tech policy conversations in India. But I do think, yeah, I'm going to maybe turn your question to say that I think platforms being in these conversations is important. I think both platforms and governments, we need to imagine like maybe smaller roles, but like bigger roles for civic participation in all of these conversations.
Right, ma'am. I think I've gotten some really good insight. Thank you so much for your answer.
So my next question is to Mr. Baxi, but I would like to hear the views of the rest of the panelists as well. So can governments come into power via CIB be regarded as democratic? And how do we develop standards or rules to tackle it?
That's a very interesting question, and I'll keep my political biases aside. See, when elections happen and a government is elected, the core tenets of democracy should be fulfilled, which is essentially, I guess, free and fair elections and one person, one vote in our country. And because those tenets are fulfilled, the government coming into power has to be considered a democratic government, whether you like it or not. The problem is that the one person, one vote is affected because the person is influenced by a lot of coordinated inauthentic behavior, whether it is propaganda, misinformation, fake news, and howsoever it is done on digital platforms. And that has to be corrected instead of, so the election process has been free and fair. And we need to keep that out of the picture. And like I answered in my previous question, this is where the election commission or the authorities have to come into the picture to safeguard the voters, the people who vote in a democratic process, to be aware of such misinformation campaigns or propaganda, and how to counter that, how to build transparency in political advertising, how to make sure that the platforms do not encourage or let loose in coordinated inauthentic behavior. So all those safeguards have to happen, so that the person who's going to vote has the right set of information around it, and is influenced by the right information instead of anything which is inauthentic. But once that is done, and once that safeguards are in place, the election process happening in a free and fair manner, so the government cannot be blamed to be a non-democratic government, whether it is elected by people who had the right set of information, or unfortunately not the right set of information. So any kind of steps that have to be taken to ensure that people have the right information, and the correct information, and are not influenced by any non-state actors, or misinformation campaigns by one political party or the others, or external governments, as the case has been somewhere in the past. So those things have to be taken care of. But I guess the government, once elected, has to be considered a democratic government.
Mr. Basu, do you have any views?
I fully agree. I think these issues need to be tackled, but I don't think that you can't regard it a democratic government because these issues existed before. So I don't have anything to add, actually.
Right. Ma'am?
Yeah, so I'm just going to channel Thomas Reid's argument, which is to say that there is a risk in overstating and understating the risk of social media misuse / coordinated inauthentic behavior / influence operations. So rumors, lies have been a part of politics for a long time. It had everything that, all the same strategies that were used in the election of Barack Obama in 2008 were sort of, maybe we can say that the same strategies were used, but on steroids in the 2016 election. So I think, we can't really say that it's not democratic, but yes, we should get a good sense of what exactly that risk is, and try and figure out how to mitigate those.
Right. Mr. Kazim, you have.
I don't have anything to add. I think Abhishek put it perfectly fine. So yeah, I think nothing to add there.
Trisha?
My next question would once again be to Mr. Basu. So I think this is somewhat a follow-up from the discussion that we just had with my previous question. So would it be safe to say that you believe that regulation in South Asia, especially digital freedom, could benefit from a more multi-stakeholder involvement than a legally enforceable solution, such as a regional treaty? Right, sir. So how do you feel that coming about, and what do you think are the most important stakeholders for us to involve at this time?
Absolutely. I think that's a great question. I think that follows up from my previous answer as well, right? Which was, what is the additional value of a regional treaty when all the countries that we are speaking of are already signatories to some of the leading human rights treaties, right? Whether it's the ICCPR or the ICESCR, and if you see the general comments to these leading international treaties, they have actually updated a lot of the original standards. So the right to privacy and so on, to the digital age. So what is the additional value that the region can bring? And I think the real answer is to facilitate exchanges between not just states, but also stakeholders, both based out of and operating within the region. But what we need to be careful of is who the stakeholder is and why they are engaging, right? So broadly, we can think of, I think when you talk about multi-stakeholder diplomacy or multi-stakeholder engagement, there are broadly 4 large stakeholders. There's the and each of these stakeholders have certain what are known as power vectors, right? Which is basically tools through which they can implement their interests. So you have governments, of course, and their power vector is obviously the fact that they represent the country in negotiations and have a monopoly over violence. You have the private sector, and their power vector is the ability to impose financial costs on the nation and the user. Then you have civil society. I think that you can subdivide a little bit, which is basically independent actors that are trying to comment on and provide observance on these issues. And then you have, within that, you have kind of experts who provide expertise but don't necessarily have a specific interest. Then you have advocacy groups that usually are always campaigning for us very I mean, they could be broad, but for on very specific grounds, right? So, and then of course you have the media, whose job is to observe and report. And I think it'll be. I'm very interested to hear what Kazim especially would have to say on this, because through the dialogue, he's been kind of real practitioner of multi-stakeholder diplomacy or multi-stakeholder regulation. But this is just my kind of observations as someone who's studied multi-stakeholder involvement a little bit. So therefore, when we look at the key stakeholders, obviously Tarunima has already, I think, covered extensively the role of private sector and how their access and influence on policy is obviously much more than civil society because of their ability to impose financial costs. The kind of power vector of civil society basically lies in public opinion and the possession of expertise, but both of these things are dependent on how the other stakeholders perceive it. So the corporations, when it really depends why they are engaging on a certain issue. And I think, again, there's something that Tarunima said. You can't be a profit-making entity on one hand, and then at the same time say that you're providing a public service or a public utility. So when you are trying to lobby various governments in South Asia and Southeast Asia on changing their, say, data localization policies because they impact your economic, they impact the economic status of these firms, then you are doing it for purely financial reasons, right? Then for them to come around and then say that, okay, we are also opposing, say, the intermediary liability guidelines on, say, grounds of democracy because we are also providing a public service. I think that's where this kind of revolving door becomes a little complicated for me to understand. So I would take much more seriously a constitutional law scholar or an advocate who has been consistent on saying that, okay, data localization is bad because it harms human rights, or that censorship, regardless of which government is in power, is bad because it prevents the ability of all citizens to participate in democratic processes, or the violation of privacy is bad because it undermines the constitutional architecture, as opposed to these kind of private sector entities who are setting norms for democracy on the one hand, then going back and saying that, okay, no, there are economic issues, and then going back and saying again that, no, we are standing up for democracy and civil rights. I think we need to be a little careful of why corporations are engaging and take them with a pinch of salt. So I'm not saying that they're always saying incorrect things, but it's always necessary to understand the political economy of why, say, Microsoft, which has taken a huge role in shaping the global cybersecurity. They've pioneered the Digital Geneva Convention, the Cybersecurity Tech Accord. They've partnered with France on the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. Are they doing it because they are, like the International Committee of the Red Cross, non-state actors simply interested in the creation of rules? Or do you take that with a pinch of salt and say, okay, there are certain cybersecurity products that Microsoft wants to guarantee. There are certain economic incentives that Microsoft has. So I think, yeah, so when we look at the involvement of stakeholders in South Asia and Southeast Asia, we need to understand that that not all stakeholders have equal power vectors, have equal lobbying influence, and therefore governments are more likely to, I suppose, ally with private sector actors than civil society, simply because the private sector has more power vectors. And again, I think it'll be very interesting to hear from other civil society stakeholders how they have engaged, who are on this call, how they have engaged with the governments to shape fairer policy making. The extent to which, again, a multi-stakeholder approach is feasible depends entirely on the strategic interests and the institutional capacity of the governments at play. So governments that have larger policy teams, that have a culture that enables multi-stakeholder engagement in diplomacy or otherwise. So just to give an example, Australia, every single statement that Australia made at the first committee, which I was talking about, the UN group of governmental experts, actually before every session, they had a consultation that was opened out to all stakeholders. And that went into the final positions that they negotiated, which hasn't happened in Indian diplomacy. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the point is that they have a very different diplomatic culture. So I think that just to sum up, like one is that you need to take each stakeholder with a pinch of salt, and secondly, the extent to which the government engages depends on how much it impacts their interests and how much of institutional capacity there is to engage. But I mean, this is all very theoretical. I think it'll be great to hear from the others who may have more practical experience engaging with the Indian or other governments.
Right, sir. And which is why I would like to direct this question and maybe invite the other panelists to please also give their inputs. Kazim, sir, would you have something to add?
I think when you talk about multi-stakeholder engagements, one is that you have, who are the stakeholders here, right? You have the private sector, you have the civil society organizations representing people, you have government, you have academia largely, and then you have media. So you have like 4 or 5 broad buckets of stakeholders who are participating in some of these engagements or trying to work towards a policy discourse, right? So I think the problem, of course, is there in the fact that there is a power imbalance in these multi-stakeholder engagements when it comes to certain kind of organizations may have more power when it comes to pushing for a policy versus, let's say, civil society, which in India, at least I know for a fact, is on a weaker wicket when it comes to being able to drive a policy change. But that doesn't mean that it's not effective enough. I think there is a lot of sort of impact civil society has when it comes to finding the right voices, finding the right allies, partners in the government, within the parliament as well, who champion the cause of privacy, or who champion the cause of human rights in a digital space. The challenge, of course, lies in finding common interest with the private sector, with the government, and between civil society. I think if you look at these three broad organizations or broad bucket of organizations, what we've seen is that unless there is common interest, there is, I mean, you don't find movement taking place. So, for example, the government would say, look, security is my biggest concern. Like, what are you doing when it comes to security? Now, as a civil society or as organizations, and a lot of us, I mean, CIS is doing a lot of work in it. You have other organizations championing the cause of privacy. So when we go in some of these discussions, you have to be able to link privacy with security, because otherwise, if you're talking to somebody who understands security as what it is, if you don't link your objective with theirs, you will not get a seat at the table, or you may not even move forward when it comes to being able to drive policy discourse. So I think it's important to find common interests, common grounds, because that's the reality of the day. Everybody has their own sort of understanding of the issue and what they want the tech space to be, which is, according to them, fair. I mean, we can't question anybody's intent, but we need to understand how this entire ecosystem works so that you can give the best for the buck you are providing. So when it comes to basic standards of privacy, everybody needs to agree and understand that it's required at this stage, even if it increases the cost of compliance for tech companies when it comes to the PDB bill, which it will, of course. Similarly, when it comes to the IT rules, you need to have better compliances, even if that means that you have to hire more people, right? So that's imminent. Now, on the other hand, if you're a government entity and you're saying, look, I need unfettered access to data, now that's a problem. Principle, when you look at principal issues, that's a principal problem, because you cannot have unfettered access to data, because right to privacy judgment, the put to summary judgment, very clear that there have to be a bucket and you have to operate within a box. For a corporate entity, that also is something problematic, because their business model gets impacted. People won't use sort of a platform if they know that there is a kind of censorship happening, and your privacy is at risk. So that will also impact business models are also linked with user rights now. So it's a very complex web, the tech ecosystem in which we operate, which is why you need to find common grounds. For a civil society organization, that's going to be the most important issue when it comes to defending rights of people in the digital age, that you have to be able to operate, and the security establishment should not collect more data than it is required. You should not do mass surveillance. It should be targeted surveillance. You should not break and do an encryption. You should not, ask for takedown of a particular kind of content. You should not force, or you should not sort of force proactive monitoring, which is AI driven, right? Because see, at the end of the day, corporates may choose also to respond to a lot of these aspects and say, okay, fine, we'll do some of this, even if it impacts rights, but we'll do it because see, at the end of the day, corporates want to make money. So that's their main agenda. So they may not budge too much when it comes to defending the rights, right? But civil society, on the other hand, their main objective is to defend the rights and privacy, and also to sort of make sure that you have a very progressive tech ecosystem, which is good for the users and good for the consumers. But at the same time, civil society organizations also cannot sort of undermine or neglect security problems. I think one thing which we've also seen is that many times we tend to not understand security issues, which are very legitimate from a government point of view, which is where I think a lot of the talks don't go through, because I've spoken to a lot of intelligence officers, ex-intelligence guys, and they say, look, these are issues we have to tackle with. How do I make sure that a non-state actor cannot spread misinformation on a platform? And those are legitimate issues. Unfortunately, they are colored because of certain reasons, and then those issues may not be highlighted as much in the civil society domain. So I think that's where you have to find common interest, that yes, security is critical, but this is how it should be done, right? You have to operate within a box, within a pattern, within certain rights, which is proportionate. It has to be necessary. It has to be legitimate. You cannot have unreasonable restrictions, but you can have reasonable restrictions. But you also cannot have no restrictions, right? So what are those reasonable restrictions is sometimes, we don't sort of arrive at a common consensus when it comes to what are those reasonable. Is it reasonable? Is breaking encryption reasonable? Maybe as per the state it is. Maybe as per the society it is not. So I think that's where we have to sort of arrive at, okay, if it is unreasonable, if there are less privacy intrusive measures, and it can be proven, like evidence-based research suggests, and we've seen this, right? A lot of the times when tech companies give data when it comes to problematic content, police doesn't register FIR. And that's a fact. If you talk to safety organizations working on the ground who are involved in this hate speech campaigns, and who talk to victims of hate speech, many times the police doesn't register the FIR. A lot of the times the data which is given to police doesn't go anywhere. So you may ask for a lot of data, but police is not doing enough with it. So there is a capacity problem. There is an operational problem on the side of the law enforcement as well, where they are not sort of using the information which Facebook or Google or other tech companies might be giving them, and they're just sitting on it, and they are demanding more data because they want to regulate the space and protect who? You're not done enough when you got the amount of data you had. What are you going to do with more data, right? Do you have the capacity to be able to understand or profile criminals based on existing metadata sets or existing limited data? It's happening in the UK, it's happening in the US, it's happening in other countries as well, where very advanced forensic capabilities are allowing governments to be able to understand a trail of a criminal act without having to read personal chats. Okay, now if that is a technology which is available through a cyber diplomacy bilateral treaty or through a tech transfer treaty, you can avail that technology and bring it here and build capacity of your police force, which in turn will help. And that's a privacy focused way. That's a less intrusive way to do policing, right? So a lot of police reforms in the tech space, police capacity is not being talked about at the same time. So while security is important, we've only brushed the surface when it comes to security. We haven't really gone in depth in understanding what are the real legitimate security issues and what are the not so big issues which may be highlighted as issues. So I think which is why I think the problem is very complex. Of course, privacy is not absolute. Security is important, but then are you doing enough as an entity also? So I think there are those debates, and we're trying to figure some things out. There are trying to understand, and organizations are working on creating more evidence which can help the forces, which can help the government to be able to do its job better. and let's see how that works.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you for that insight. Tarunima ma'am, would you have something to add here?
Actually, no, I think that was a very difficult answer to top up. So I think Kazim gave a very comprehensive answer. I'll pause at that.
All right, ma'am. Thank you. And how about you, Baxi sir? Do you have something to add?
No, Kazim covered it well, and I'll skip. I'm more of an outside observer to the tech policy domain anyway, and Kazim answered for all of us.
Right, sir. Thank you so much. And I think that brings us to the end of the discussion. On behalf of the Parley project, we would like to extend a warm thanks to all our panelists, Kazim Rizvi, Arindrajit Basu, Abhishek Baxi, and Tarunima Prabhakaran, for giving us an enriching session. Thank you everyone for attending today's event. Kindly note that the research paper presentation will be taking place tomorrow at 11 a.m. We hope to see you with us again. Thank you so much. And if there's anything the panelists would like to add, otherwise I think we can wrap this up.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for hosting us.
So much for joining.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.